Some people don't come to weddings to celebrate love, they come to be reminded they were never chosen. The clink of champagne glasses echoed beneath crystal chandeliers, scattering prismatic light across silk dresses and tailored suits, but at the very edge of the ballroom, Emily Carter sat perfectly still, her fingers wrapped around a glass of water she hadn't touched, her knuckles pale against the soft glow of the table candle as laughter rose and fell like waves she didn't belong to. She adjusted the simple navy dress she'd worn 3 times before, smoothing a wrinkle that no one else would notice, because everyone here noticed everything else about her instead, the empty chair beside her, the absence of a partner, the quiet fact that she had arrived alone while the invitation had clearly been addressed to couples. A whisper drifted from the next table, not meant for her but never far enough away, "Isn't she the one with the kid?" And another voice answered with a soft, almost pitying hum, the kind that stung more than cruelty. Emily lowered her eyes, forcing a small smile that felt practiced, controlled, something she had learned to wear the same way she learned to stretch every dollar at the grocery store, every hour of sleep between work and motherhood, because dignity was the one thing she refused to lose, even here, especially here. Across the room, the bride laughed, radiant and surrounded, her white dress catching every light, and for a brief second their eyes met, then slipped away just as quickly, like a memory neither wanted to hold too long. Emily exhaled slowly, steadying herself, reminding her heart that she had survived harder nights than this, nights with a crying child at 2 a.m., nights counting bills under a flickering kitchen light, nights when hope felt thinner than the walls of her small apartment. She reached for her phone, not to text anyone, just to have something to hold, something to anchor her in a room where she felt like a misplaced detail, when suddenly the hum of the ballroom shifted, subtle at first, like a change in air pressure before a storm, then unmistakable as conversations softened and heads turned toward the entrance. Emily didn't look up immediately, she had learned not to chase attention, but she felt it anyway, the ripple of presence moving through the crowd, the kind that didn't ask for space but took it effortlessly. Footsteps approached, measured, confident, stopping beside her table, and for a moment she assumed it was someone looking for an empty seat, someone who would realize their mistake and move on, but the chair beside her pulled back, the quiet scrape against polished floor cutting through the noise, and when she finally lifted her gaze, she found herself looking at a man who didn't belong to the edges of rooms. His suit was perfectly tailored, charcoal gray catching the light in subtle lines, his expression calm, unreadable, as if the entire room bending around him was something he barely noticed, and yet his eyes, when they met hers, were unexpectedly gentle, steady in a way that made her forget the whispers, the stares, the loneliness pressing at her chest. He leaned slightly closer, just enough that his voice wouldn't carry beyond the space between them, and in a tone so quiet it almost felt like a secret, he said, "Pretend we're a couple." Emily blinked, certain she had misheard, her heart skipping not from excitement but from confusion, from the absurdity of a stranger choosing her out of a room full of people who would have gladly taken that seat. And yet he didn't look away, didn't smile like it was a joke, just waited with a calm certainty that unsettled and steadied her at the same time. Around them, the music continued, glasses clinked, laughter rose again. But something had shifted, something small and irreversible. Because for the first time that night, Emily wasn't invisible anymore, and she hadn't done anything to earn it except be exactly who she was. Emily's breath caught for a fraction of a second, her fingers tightening around the cool glass in her hand as she studied his face, searching for any hint of mockery, any sign that this was some elaborate joke played at her expense, but there was none, only a quiet certainty in his gaze that felt strangely grounding, like he had already decided something she had not yet agreed to. Her instinct told her to refuse, to protect what little control she still had over how she was seen tonight, but then another ripple of laughter rose from the nearby tables, and she felt those same eyes again, measuring, judging, reducing her to a story they thought they understood. And before she could second-guess herself, she gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. The change was immediate, subtle but undeniable, as his hand moved to rest lightly over hers on the table, not possessive, not performative, just enough to be seen, just enough to rewrite the narrative unfolding around them. And suddenly the glances shifted, curiosity replacing quiet dismissal, conversations softening as people tried to place her, to understand how someone like her was now sitting beside someone like him. "Relax," he murmured, his voice calm, steady, like he had done this before, though something in his tone suggested he had not. "You do not have to say anything. Just stay." Emily swallowed, her heart still racing, but there was something unexpectedly comforting in the simplicity of his request, something that did not demand explanation or apology, just presence, something she had not been offered in a very long time. A server approached with a polite smile that seemed suddenly more attentive than before, offering a fresh glass of champagne she knew was far more expensive than anything she would ever order for herself, and for a brief moment she hesitated, but the man beside her gave a slight nod, as if to say it was allowed, as if to remind her that tonight, she did not have to calculate every small decision. Across the room, she noticed the bride's mother watching now, her expression carefully neutral but her attention unmistakably fixed on their table, and Emily felt a flicker of unease, a reminder that this fragile shift could just as easily turn against her, that whatever protection this stranger offered came with questions she could not yet answer. "Why me?" she whispered finally, her voice low enough that it barely carried beyond them, the question slipping out before she could stop it, because nothing about this felt random, not the way he had chosen her without hesitation, not the way he seemed completely unaffected by the attention his presence commanded. He did not answer right away, his gaze drifting briefly across the room as if considering something far beyond the moment, then returning to her with that same quiet focus. "Because you did not try to be seen," he said simply, and something about those words settled into her chest in a way she could not explain, as if he had noticed the one thing she had worked hardest to hide. Before she could respond, a sharply dressed man approached their table, his smile polite but edged with something colder beneath the surface, the kind of smile that came from habit rather than warmth. "I do not believe we have been introduced," he said, his eyes flicking between them with calculated curiosity, and Emily felt her pulse quicken again, the fragile illusion suddenly tested, but the man beside her did not move, did not release her hand, only leaned back slightly in his chair. With an ease that felt almost effortless, "Then let me save you the trouble," he replied calmly, his tone polite but final, as if introductions were optional and explanations unnecessary, and in that moment Emily realized something that made her chest tighten, not with fear, but with something dangerously close to hope, because for the first time in a long time, someone was not asking her to justify her place in the room, they were simply giving it to her. The man standing at their table did not sit down, he lingered just long enough to make his presence known, his polished shoes angled slightly outward, his posture carrying the quiet authority of someone used to being acknowledged, but not tonight, not here, because the man beside Emily did not rise, did not offer a hand, did not even shift his expression beyond a calm, almost indifferent glance that said more than words ever could. The silence stretched just a second too long before the newcomer gave a tight smile and stepped back, retreating with a nod that felt more like surrender than courtesy, and Emily felt it then, the subtle shift in the room deepening, like a current pulling everything in a new direction she did not yet understand. Her pulse had not slowed, if anything it had grown steadier in a way that surprised her, as if the fear that had followed her into this ballroom was slowly loosening its grip, replaced by something unfamiliar, something quieter, something that felt dangerously close to being seen without judgment. She became aware of his hand again, still resting over hers, warm, steady, not demanding, and yet it grounded her in a way she had not expected, and for a moment she allowed herself to simply exist in that space, not as the woman people whispered about, not as the single mother who always had to explain, but just as someone sitting beside another person who had chosen her presence without condition. The band shifted into a softer melody, the low hum of strings blending with the murmur of conversation, and couples began to move toward the dance floor, the gentle sway of bodies filling the center of the room with practiced elegance, and Emily instinctively withdrew her hand, unsure of what came next, unsure of how far this unspoken arrangement extended. He noticed, of course he did, his gaze following the movement without judgment, only a quiet awareness that made her feel both exposed and strangely safe at the same time. "You do not have to stay if you are uncomfortable," he said, his voice low, measured, offering her an exit she had not realized she needed, and for a second she considered it, the familiar instinct to retreat, to return to the safety of being unnoticed, but then she glanced around the room, at the same faces that had dismissed her minutes ago, now watching with curiosity, with calculation, and something inside her resisted the idea of shrinking back into that version of herself. "I am fine," she replied softly, the words steadier than she expected, and he gave a small nod, not approving, not surprised, just accepting, as if her choice had always been hers to make. A server passed by again, offering a tray of small desserts, delicate and perfectly arranged. And this time Emily reached out without hesitation, taking one, not because she was hungry, but because she could, because for once she was not measuring her worth against the price of what she accepted. Across the room, she caught a glimpse of the bride's mother again, now speaking quietly to another guest, their eyes flicking toward Emily before quickly looking away, and she felt it, the shift from judgment to curiosity, from dismissal to quiet speculation, and it unsettled her more than the whispers ever had. "They are trying to figure out who you are," he said, as if reading the tension in her shoulders, his tone almost thoughtful, and she let out a small breath she had not realized she was holding. "I am not anyone important," she admitted, the truth simple, unembellished, something she had made peace with long ago. He turned slightly toward her then, his expression softening just enough to change the air between them. "That depends on who is looking," he replied, and the way he said it made something shift inside her, something fragile and long buried, because for the first time in a very long time, someone was not defining her by what she lacked, but by something she had never thought to claim. The music swelled gently, and without making a spectacle of it, he stood, offering his hand in a gesture so natural it did not feel like a performance. And Emily hesitated only a second before placing her hand in his, the contact steady, grounding, as he led her toward the dance floor, not pulling, not rushing, just guiding, and as the lights softened around them and the room seemed to blur at the edges, Emily realized that whatever this moment was, whatever reason had brought him to her table, it was no longer just an escape from embarrassment, it was something else entirely, something that felt like the beginning of a story she had never imagined herself being part of. The music wrapped around them like a quiet invitation, soft piano notes blending with the low hum of conversation as Emily stepped onto the dance floor, her hand still in his, her pulse steady but alert, every movement feeling both unfamiliar and strangely natural at the same time. She had not danced in years, not since life had become a series of responsibilities measured in grocery lists and bedtime routines. But the way he guided her made it effortless, his touch light, respectful, leaving space for her to follow without feeling controlled, and for the first time that evening, she allowed herself to breathe without calculating the next moment. The polished floor reflected the chandelier light in broken fragments beneath their feet, and as they moved slowly among the other couples, Emily became aware of the subtle shift in how people looked at her now, not with dismissal, but with curiosity, with quiet attempts to understand how she had stepped into a place no one had expected her to occupy. She kept her gaze low at first, focusing on the rhythm, on the simple act of moving forward and back, but gradually she lifted her eyes, meeting his again, and there was something in his expression that did not match the world around them, something calm, almost detached from the performance of the evening, as if this moment was not about appearances for him at all. "You are doing fine," he said quietly, sensing her hesitation, and she let out a soft breath that almost turned into a laugh. "I am trying not to step on your shoes," she admitted, her voice lighter than it had been all night, and for a brief second, the corner of his mouth lifted, not quite a smile, but enough to change the air between them. They turned slowly, the movement unhurried, and as they did, Emily caught sight of the bride's mother approaching the edge of the dance floor, her posture composed but her attention unmistakably fixed on them, and the fragile ease Emily had begun to feel tightened slightly in her chest. "She is coming," Emily murmured under her breath, instinctively aware of the scrutiny that would follow, but he did not look away, did not release her, only adjusted his hold slightly, bringing her a fraction closer in a way that felt protective without being possessive, as if he understood the unspoken tension and chose to stand within it rather than avoid it. The older woman stopped just a few feet away, her expression polite, her smile carefully measured as she waited for the music to carry them closer, and when it did, she spoke with a tone that carried both warmth and inquiry. "I do not believe we have met," her eyes moving between them with quiet precision, and Emily felt the familiar urge to explain, to justify her presence, to offer context that would make her acceptable, but before she could speak, the man beside her answered, his voice even, composed, "That is correct," and nothing more, no introduction, no elaboration, just a statement that closed the space for further questioning without raising his tone. The woman's smile held for a second longer, then softened into something less certain, as if she had encountered a boundary she was not used to crossing, and with a small nod, she stepped back, retreating into the safety of the crowd, leaving behind a silence that felt louder than any words. Emily blinked, the moment settling over her in a way she could not fully process, because she had expected to be examined, to be measured and quietly dismissed, but instead she had been shielded, not with force, not with explanation, but with a simple refusal to play the part they expected. You did not tell her who I am, Emily said softly once the distance between them and the others widened again, her voice carrying both confusion and something else she could not yet name, and he looked at her then, his gaze steady, thoughtful. They will decide that on their own, he replied, and the words lingered, heavier than they seemed, because for the first time, Emily realized that the story people told about her did not have to come from her explanations, it could come from what they chose to see, and tonight, for reasons she still did not understand, he was changing what they saw. The music faded into a softer note as the song came to an end, and for a brief moment, Emily forgot to let go, her hand still resting in his as if the movement between them had not fully stopped, as if stepping away would break something fragile that had only just begun to exist. Around them, couples drifted apart with quiet laughter and murmured words, the room returning to its steady rhythm of celebration. But the space between Emily and the man beside her felt suspended, untouched by the noise, held in a silence that was not uncomfortable, just unfamiliar. She finally withdrew her hand slowly, almost reluctantly, her fingers brushing against his for a second longer than necessary before she stepped back, her breath steady but her thoughts anything but. Thank you, she said softly, the words simple but carrying more weight than they should have, because she was not just thanking him for the dance. She was thanking him for something she could not yet name, something that had shifted inside her without permission. He gave a small nod, as if gratitude was not something he expected, his gaze briefly scanning the room before returning to her. Do you want to sit? He asked, his tone as calm as before, offering rather than deciding, and she nodded, following him back toward their table where the candles still flickered gently, casting soft shadows that seemed less harsh now than they had before. As they sat, Emily became aware again of the attention, not as sharp as before, but still present, quieter now, more measured, as if people were trying to make sense of a story that had changed too quickly for them to follow. She reached for her glass again, this time taking a small sip, the cool water grounding her, reminding her that this was real, that she was still herself, still the woman who had walked into this room alone, even if the room no longer saw her that way. You still have not told me your name, she said after a moment, the question coming more easily now, her voice steadier than before, and he looked at her, a brief pause passing between them as if he were deciding something. Then he answered simply, Alexander, no last name, no title. Just a name that somehow felt complete without anything added. Emily, she replied, and the exchange felt oddly significant, like a quiet agreement between two people who had chosen not to complicate what did not need to be explained. Before she could say anything else, a sudden burst of laughter erupted near the head table, drawing attention as someone raised a glass for a toast. The sound of a spoon tapping against crystal echoing through the room, calling everyone to focus, and Emily turned slightly in her chair, watching as the best man began to speak, his voice carrying warmth and humor, weaving stories of friendship and love that filled the room with easy laughter. But as the words flowed, Emily noticed something else, something subtle but undeniable, the way Alexander's attention drifted, not toward the speaker, but across the room, his gaze settling briefly on a small group of older guests near the back, his expression unreadable for a second before it returned to its usual calm. She followed his line of sight without thinking, her eyes landing on the group he had been watching, and for a moment, nothing seemed out of place, until she noticed one of the women holding a delicate gold bracelet, its design simple but distinct, catching the light in a way that made Emily's breath hitch almost imperceptibly, because it looked almost identical to something she had seen before, something that did not belong in this room, something that belonged to a different part of her life entirely. Her hand moved instinctively to her own wrist, where a thin, worn bracelet rested beneath the sleeve of her dress, hidden, unnoticed, something she rarely thought about anymore, and yet now, under the soft glow of the chandelier, it felt suddenly important, as if a quiet thread had been pulled between two distant moments. connecting them in a way she did not yet understand. She glanced back at Alexander, her curiosity rising, but he had already looked away, his expression composed, giving nothing away, and for the first time since he had sat beside her, Emily felt a different kind of question forming, not about why he had chosen her, but about what he already knew. The toast continued, laughter rising and falling in waves across the ballroom, but Emily could no longer hear the words clearly, her attention caught somewhere else entirely, tethered to the faint glimmer of gold she had seen across the room and the quiet shift she had felt beside her. Her fingers brushed lightly against the bracelet hidden beneath her sleeve, the thin chain worn smooth over years, the small charm resting against her skin like a memory she had never fully understood, something her mother had given her without explanation, only a soft smile and a simple sentence she had been too young to question at the time. She lowered her hand slowly, her thoughts pulling her in two directions, one grounded in the present, in the soft candlelight and the steady presence of the man beside her, and the other drifting backward, toward fragments of a past she had learned to leave untouched. You noticed it. Alexander's voice came quietly, not as a question, but as a recognition, and Emily turned to him, surprised by the certainty in his tone, her eyes searching his face for clues he did not offer. The bracelet, she said softly, unsure why she felt the need to confirm it out loud, as if naming it would make the connection clearer, more real, and he gave a slight nod, his gaze steady, thoughtful in a way that suggested he had already seen more than she had realized. It is not common, he said, his words measured, careful, as if each one mattered, and Emily felt a subtle tightening in her chest, not fear, but something closer to anticipation, like standing at the edge of something unknown. She glanced again toward the group across the room, but the woman with the matching bracelet had turned away, her laughter blending back into the crowd, leaving behind only the echo of a detail that now felt too specific to ignore. My mother gave it to me, Emily said after a moment, her voice softer now, more personal than anything she had shared that evening, and for a second she wondered why she was telling him this, why it felt easier to speak to a stranger than to people who had known her for years. She said it was important, but she never explained why. She added, her fingers instinctively touching the edge of the charm again, as if it might hold an answer she had missed. Alexander did not respond immediately, his gaze drifting briefly downward, as if tracing the invisible line between her words and something in his own thoughts, and when he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than before, carrying a weight she could not quite define. Sometimes people leave answers in pieces, not because they want to hide them, but because they expect someone to find them when the time is right, and the way he said it made Emily's breath catch slightly, because it did not sound like a general thought, it sounded like something he believed, something he knew. The room around them shifted again as the toast ended, applause rising and glasses lifting in celebration, pulling attention back to the center of the ballroom, but the space at their table felt separate now, like a quieter world within the larger one, where the rules were different, where small details carried more meaning than grand gestures. You knew I would be here, Emily said suddenly, the realization forming before she could stop it, her voice low but certain, because nothing about this night felt accidental anymore, not the way he had chosen her, not the way he had noticed something so specific, something she herself had barely thought about in years. Alexander met her gaze without hesitation, his expression unchanged, but there was no denial in his eyes, only a calm acceptance of the question she had asked without fully understanding it. I knew someone with that bracelet would be here, he said, his words precise, offering truth without explanation, and Emily felt the ground beneath her shift. Not in fear, but in awareness, because whatever this was, whatever had brought him to her table, it was no longer just about a moment of kindness or a simple act of protection. It was something deeper, something that had been set in motion long before she walked into this room alone, something that had been waiting for her to arrive. Emily felt the words settle over her like a quiet echo, not loud, not overwhelming, but impossible to ignore, and for a moment she did not know what to say, because the man sitting beside her was no longer just a stranger who had offered her a place at the table. He was someone who had been expecting a moment like this, someone who had been looking for something, or someone, long before she walked into the room. The soft hum of conversation returned around them, guests rising from their seats. As the evening shifted toward dinner, chairs scraping gently against polished floors, silverware catching the light as waitstaff moved with quiet efficiency, but Emily remained still, her thoughts turning inward, trying to piece together something that did not yet make sense. Why She asked finally, the question simple but carrying layers she could not fully unravel, her voice steady even as her pulse quickened, because this was no longer about fitting into the room, this was about understanding why she had been pulled into something she had never seen coming. Alexander's gaze did not waver, but there was a slight pause before he answered, as if he were choosing what to reveal and what to hold back. Because that bracelet does not belong to just anyone, he said, his tone calm, deliberate, and Emily felt her fingers instinctively close around the edge of her sleeve, as if the small piece of jewelry had suddenly become something far more significant than she had ever believed. She shook her head slightly, a quiet resistance rising in her chest. It is just something my mother gave me, she insisted, the words coming out softer than she intended, because part of her still held on to the simplicity of that truth, the version of her life that had always been enough, even when it was not easy. Alexander studied her for a moment, not dismissing her words, but not fully agreeing either, and there was something in his expression that made her feel as if he was seeing a version of her story she had never been told. What did your mother say about it? He asked, and the question pulled her back into memory, into a small kitchen filled with the scent of coffee and the quiet hum of an old refrigerator, into a moment she had not thought about in years. She said it would lead me to the right place one day, Emily replied slowly, her voice softer now, as if speaking the words out loud gave them a weight they had not carried before, and as soon as she said it, she felt something shift, like a piece of a puzzle clicking into place just enough to reveal that there was more missing. Alexander nodded once, a subtle acknowledgement that felt less like surprise and more like confirmation. And that was what unsettled her the most, not what he was saying, but how little it seemed to surprise him. Across the room, the same group of older guests began to move toward the head table, their quiet conversation blending into the larger flow of the evening, and Emily noticed again the woman with the matching bracelet, her hand now resting lightly on the arm of a man who carried himself with a quiet authority that reminded her of Alexander, though older, more established. As if time had shaped him into something even more solid, Emily followed the movement with her eyes, a growing sense of connection forming between the details she had noticed and the answers she had not yet received, and when she turned back, she found Alexander watching her, not with urgency, not with expectation, but with a calm patience that suggested he was waiting for her to reach something on her own. You knew I would ask, she said, her voice quieter now, more certain, and he gave a slight nod, not denying it, not explaining it, just allowing the truth to exist. Between them, the room felt different again, not because of the people or the music or the shifting light, but because Emily was no longer just observing it, she was part of something unfolding within it, something that had started long before tonight and would not end when the music stopped. She took a slow breath, steadying herself, her fingers brushing once more against the bracelet hidden beneath her sleeve, and for the first time, she did not see it as something small or forgotten. She saw it as a beginning, a quiet thread pulling her forward into a story she had never been given the chance to understand, until now. The clatter of silverware and the soft murmur of conversation filled the ballroom as dinner was served, but Emily barely noticed the plates being placed in front of her, her attention anchored somewhere deeper, somewhere quieter, where the meaning of everything that had been said began to settle in ways she could not ignore. She watched as the woman with the matching bracelet moved closer to the head table, her laughter controlled, her posture elegant, every detail of her presence reflecting a life that had never required explanation, and yet that single detail, that small piece of gold resting against her wrist, now felt like a bridge between two completely different worlds. Emily's fingers lingered against her own bracelet again, this time not out of habit, but with intention, as if she were finally seeing it for what it might be rather than what she had always assumed it to be. Who is she? Emily asked quietly, her voice careful, as if the answer might carry more weight than she was ready for, and Alexander followed her gaze without hesitation, his expression composed but no longer distant. Her name is Margaret Whitmore, he said, each word deliberate. She is on the board of one of my companies, and the simplicity of his answer only made the connection feel more complicated, because it did not explain why the same bracelet existed in two lives that had never intersected, at least not in any way Emily had ever known. Emily nodded slowly, absorbing the name, letting it settle into her thoughts alongside everything else that no longer felt like coincidence, and for a moment she considered asking more, pushing for answers she was not sure she was ready to hear, but something held her back, something told her that this was not a story that would unfold all at once. The soft clink of a glass drew attention again as another toast began, this time from the bride herself. Her voice warm, emotional, speaking about love, about trust, about finding the person who sees you fully and chooses you anyway, and Emily felt the words land differently now, not as something distant or idealized, but as something closer, something she had not expected to feel tonight. She glanced at Alexander briefly, wondering if he heard the same thing she did, if the words carried any weight for him. But his attention remained steady, not on the speaker, but somewhere between the moment and the space they shared, as if he were listening to something else. Entirely. There is more you are not telling me, Emily said softly, not accusing, not demanding, just stating what had become obvious, and this time, Alexander did not deflect, he did not offer a simple answer or redirect the conversation, instead he leaned back slightly in his chair, his gaze thoughtful, as if he were considering how much of the truth belonged to him to give. There are things you need to see for yourself, he said after a moment, his tone calm but firm, and Emily felt a flicker of frustration rise beneath her composure, not because she doubted him, but because she was no longer content with partial answers, not when the questions had begun to feel this real. She looked down at her plate, untouched, then back at him, her expression steady. And if I do not know where to look, she asked, and for the first time, something in his expression shifted, not dramatically, not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough for her to see that this moment mattered. He reached into the inner pocket of his jacket, his movements unhurried, and placed a simple card on the table between them, sliding it toward her with quiet intention. Then you start by showing up, he said, and Emily's eyes dropped to the card, her breath catching slightly as she read the name printed there, the same name he had given her only minutes ago, but now with a weight that made it feel like something more than an introduction. She looked back up at him, her thoughts racing, her heart steady but aware, because whatever this was, whatever had begun the moment he sat beside her, it was no longer confined to this room, it was something that would follow her beyond the music, beyond the lights, into a place where answers waited, whether she was ready for them or not. Emily did not touch the card right away, her eyes lingering on the clean, sharp lettering as if it might shift into something else if she stared long enough, but it did not. It remained exactly what it was, a name, a position, a place in a world she had never imagined herself stepping into. The soft glow of the candle beside it made the edges shimmer slightly, drawing her attention back again and again, as if the small rectangle carried more weight than the entire room around her. She finally reached for it, her fingers careful, almost hesitant, as though picking it up would confirm something she was not ready to fully accept, and when she did, the paper felt solid, real, grounding in a way that made everything else seem less certain. You expect me to just show up? She asked quietly, her voice steady but threaded with disbelief. Because nothing in her life had ever been that simple, not opportunities, not answers, not the kind of doors that opened without explanation. Alexander met her gaze without hesitation, his expression unchanged, calm in a way that suggested he had already considered every question she was now asking. I expect you to decide if you want to know the truth, he replied, his tone even, leaving the choice entirely with her, and that was what unsettled her most, not the mystery, not the connection, but the fact that he was not pushing, not persuading, only offering something she had to choose on her own. Emily exhaled slowly, her thumb brushing against the edge of the card as her thoughts moved faster than she could sort them, because part of her wanted to dismiss it, to return to the version of her life that was predictable, manageable, defined by routines she understood, but another part, quieter but stronger, recognized that something had already changed, that the moment he sat beside her had shifted the path she thought she was on. Across the room, the laughter rose again, guests leaning into conversations, glasses raised, the celebration continuing as if nothing extraordinary had happened, and yet Emily felt as though she were standing at the edge of something entirely different, something that existed just beyond the surface of the evening. She slipped the card into her small clutch, her movements deliberate, not rushed, not careless, as if placing it there was a decision she could not undo. And when she looked back up, she noticed that Alexander was watching her, not with expectation, not with pressure, but with a quiet awareness that made her feel seen in a way she had not expected. You knew I would not walk away from this, she said softly, the realization settling into her voice, and for a brief second, something almost like a smile touched his expression, subtle, restrained, but enough to confirm what she already felt. I Hoped you would not, he answered, and the honesty in those words landed differently than everything else he had said, because it was not calculated, not distant, it was simple, and that made it harder to ignore. The music shifted again, a livelier rhythm pulling more guests toward the dance floor, the energy of the room rising as the night moved forward, but Emily remained seated, her focus no longer on the celebration, but on the quiet thread that had begun to pull her in a new direction. "What happens if I do not come?" she asked after a moment, not as a challenge, but as a way to understand the weight of what he was offering, and Alexander's gaze held hers steadily, his answer coming without hesitation. "Then nothing changes," he said, his voice calm, certain, and the simplicity of it struck her harder than anything else, because it meant that the life she knew would remain exactly as it was, untouched, unchanged, safe in its predictability. Emily nodded slowly, the truth of that settling into her chest, because she understood now that this was not about him, not really, it was about her, about whether she was willing to step into something unknown, something that might change everything she thought she knew about herself. She glanced once more across the room, toward the woman with the matching bracelet, toward the life that seemed so distant and yet now felt connected in ways she could not ignore. And then she looked back at Alexander, her expression steady, her voice quiet but certain. "Then I guess I have already made my choice," and as the words left her, she felt something shift inside her, not dramatically, not all at once, but enough to know that whatever came next, she would not be the same person who had walked into this room alone. The music swelled again, louder now, brighter, pulling the room back into celebration, but Emily remained still for a moment longer, her decision settling into her chest like something both heavy and steady at the same time, as if she had just stepped across an invisible line she could not return from. She became aware of Alexander watching her, not with surprise, not with approval, but with a quiet understanding that felt almost grounding, like he had expected this moment not because he knew her, but because he trusted something in her she was only beginning to recognize herself. "Good," he said simply, the word soft, almost lost beneath the music, but it carried a weight that made her straighten slightly in her seat, as if acknowledging that what she had just chosen mattered more than she could fully see yet. A server passed by again, refilling glasses, adjusting plates, the rhythm of service continuing seamlessly around them, and Emily realized how strange it felt that everything else in the room remained exactly the same while her world had shifted so completely. She reached for her water again, taking a slow sip, grounding herself in the simple act, reminding herself that she was still here, still present, even as her thoughts stretched towards something beyond the evening. "What happens now?" she asked quietly, not out of impatience, but because the stillness between them felt like a pause before something inevitable. And Alexander leaned back slightly, his gaze thoughtful. "Now you finish your evening," he replied, his tone calm, almost matter-of-fact, and Emily blinked, the simplicity of his answer catching her off guard, because she had expected something more immediate, something that would pull her further into whatever this was, but instead he was asking her to remain exactly where she was. "That is it?" she asked, a hint of disbelief slipping into her voice, and for a brief second, something softer touched his expression. "That is enough for tonight," he said, and the way he spoke made it clear that this was not avoidance, it was intention, as if he understood that whatever came next could not be rushed, could not be forced into a single moment. Emily nodded slowly, letting that settle, because part of her felt relieved, grateful even, that she did not have to step into everything all at once, that she could carry this decision with her beyond the ballroom, beyond the music, into a space where she could think, where she could understand, across the room. The bride and groom moved onto the dance floor again, laughter following them as guests gathered closer, the energy lifting once more, and Emily watched for a second before glancing back at Alexander, noticing how his attention remained steady, present, but never demanding, never pulling her beyond what she was ready to give. "Will I see you there?" she asked, her voice softer now, more certain, and he held her gaze for a moment, just long enough for the question to settle between them. "If you come, I will be there," he answered, and the simplicity of it felt like a promise without pressure, something that existed without needing to be defined. Emily let out a slow breath, the tension in her shoulders easing in a way she had not noticed until it began to fade, because for the first time in a long time, she was not being asked to prove anything, not her worth, not her place, not her story. She was simply being given a choice. The music carried on, the laughter rising again, and as she sat there, the card resting quietly in her clutch, the bracelet hidden beneath her sleeve, Emily realized that this night was no longer about the wedding, no longer about the whispers or the stares or the loneliness she had walked in with, it was about something else entirely. Something that had found her when she least expected it, something that did not demand that she change who she was, but instead asked her to discover it. She glanced once more at Alexander, committing the quiet steadiness of his presence to memory, not because she was afraid it would disappear, but because she understood now that whatever happened next would not depend on this moment alone, it would depend on what she chose when the lights faded, when the music stopped, when she stepped back into her own life carrying something she had not had before, a question she was finally ready to answer. The evening moved forward in a steady rhythm, music blending into laughter, voices rising and falling like a tide that no longer pulled at Emily the way it had when she first arrived, because now she sat differently, not on the edge of her chair, not shrinking into the background, but present, aware, carrying something unseen that made the room feel less overwhelming and more distant at the same time. She noticed the small things she had missed before, the way people glanced at her and then quickly looked away, not out of dismissal now, but uncertainty, as if they were recalibrating the story they had already written about her, and for the first time, she did not feel the need to correct them, to explain herself, to make herself easier to understand. Across from her, Alexander remained composed, his posture relaxed, his attention shifting naturally between the room and the quiet space they shared, never demanding, never intrusive, and yet his presence continued to anchor her in a way she could not ignore. "You are thinking too much," he said at one point, his voice low, not critical, just observant. And Emily let out a small breath that almost turned into a smile, because he was not wrong, she had been turning everything over in her mind, every word, every glance, every detail that no longer felt random. "I am trying to understand what just happened," she admitted, her tone honest, unguarded in a way that surprised even her, and he nodded slightly, as if that answer made perfect sense. "You do not have to understand it tonight," he replied, and there was something reassuring in that. Something that allowed her to release the pressure she had unknowingly placed on herself to make everything clear immediately. The music shifted again, slower now, more intimate, couples returning to the dance floor in pairs, and Emily watched them for a moment before looking down at her hands, at the faint line where her bracelet rested beneath the fabric, feeling its presence more strongly than ever, not as an accessory, but as a question she had carried for years without asking. "Do you ever regret knowing things you cannot ignore?" she asked suddenly, the question slipping out before she could filter it, and for a brief moment, Alexander's gaze sharpened, not with surprise, but with recognition, as if she had touched on something he understood more deeply than he let on. "Only when I pretend I do not know them," he answered after a pause, his voice quieter now, carrying a weight that made her chest tighten slightly, because she understood what he meant, even if she had never put it into words before. Emily nodded slowly, letting that settle, because it felt true in a way she could not argue with, and for the first time, she realized that whatever she had chosen tonight was not just about curiosity, it was about honesty, about no longer ignoring the parts of her life that had never fully made sense. The evening continued to unfold around them, dessert being served, conversation softening as the night stretched on, and Emily found herself more at ease with each passing moment, not because the room had changed, but because she had. When she finally glanced at the time on her phone, she realized how late it had become, how far the night had moved without her noticing, and a quiet sense of responsibility returned, reminding her that beyond this ballroom, beyond this moment, there was a life waiting for her, a child who would wake in the morning, routines that would continue regardless of what she had discovered tonight. She slipped her phone back into her clutch, her fingers brushing once more against the card inside, and as she looked up at Alexander, there was something different in her expression now, something steadier, more certain, not because she had all the answers, but because she had accepted that she did not need them yet. "I should go soon," she said softly, the words carrying both reluctance and resolve, because leaving did not feel like walking away anymore. It felt like carrying something forward, and Alexander inclined his head slightly, acknowledging her choice without question, without hesitation, as if he had always known that this moment would come, and that what mattered was not how it ended, but what she chose to do next. Emily stood slowly, her fingers brushing against the edge of the table as she steadied herself, not because she was unbalanced, but because leaving felt different now, heavier in a way she had not expected, as if this moment carried more than just a goodbye. The room continued around her without pause, laughter rising, music flowing, the soft glow of chandeliers casting everything in a warm illusion of permanence. But she knew better now. She knew how quickly a moment could shift, how a single decision could redraw the boundaries of a life she had once believed was fixed. She glanced down briefly, smoothing the fabric of her dress out of habit, a small gesture that once carried insecurity, but now felt more like grounding, like reminding herself that she was still the same person who had walked into this room, even if everything inside her had changed. "Thank you," she said quietly, turning back to Alexander, her voice steady, no longer uncertain, because this gratitude was not fragile, it was clear, it was chosen. He rose as well, not out of formality, but with a natural ease that matched everything else about him, and for a moment, they simply stood there, the space between them filled with something unspoken, something that did not need to be named to be understood. "You found your place tonight," he said, his voice calm, but there was something softer beneath it, something that felt less like observation and more like acknowledgement, and Emily felt those words settle into her chest in a way she would carry with her long after she left this room. She shook her head slightly, a small smile forming, not dismissing his words, but reshaping them. "No," she replied gently, "I decided to stop leaving it," and for the first time, his expression shifted just enough to reveal something genuine, something that had not been there before, a quiet approval, or perhaps recognition. The distance between them felt smaller now, not because they had moved, but because something in their understanding had changed, and Emily realized that whatever connection had brought them together tonight was no longer fragile, it was steady, rooted in something deeper than chance. She reached into her clutch, her fingers closing around the card again, feeling its presence like a promise she had not yet fulfilled, and she held it for a second longer before letting it rest back inside, not because she doubted it, but because she no longer needed to prove anything in this moment. "I will come," she said simply, not asking, not hesitating, just stating what had already become true, and Alexander met her gaze with the same quiet certainty he had carried all night. "I know," he replied, and there was no arrogance in his voice, only a calm understanding that felt almost inevitable. Emily nodded once, letting the silence settle between them in a way that felt complete, not unfinished, because this was not an ending, it was a transition, a shift from one part of her life into another she had not yet seen. She turned then, stepping away from the table, her movements unhurried, her posture straight, not because anyone was watching, but because she no longer felt the need to hide within herself. As she moved through the room, she felt the glances again, the quiet curiosity, the unspoken questions, but they no longer held power over her, they were just background noise to something far more important unfolding within her. When she reached the exit, she paused for a brief second, her hand resting on the cool metal of the door handle, and she allowed herself one last glance back, not searching, not questioning, just acknowledging the moment for what it had been, a turning point she had not planned, but had chosen. Alexander was still there, exactly where she had left him, his presence unchanged, steady, and for a brief second, their eyes met across the distance, no words, no gestures, just a quiet understanding that whatever had begun here would continue beyond it. Emily pushed the door open, stepping out into the cool night air, the sound of the celebration fading behind her as the world shifted again, quieter now, more real, and as she took a slow breath, the city lights stretching out in front of her, she realized that she was not walking away from something, she was walking toward it, carrying with her a choice she had made not out of fear or uncertainty, but out of something far stronger, the willingness to finally follow a path that had been waiting for her all along. The night air felt cooler than Emily expected, brushing gently against her skin as she stepped away from the glow of the ballroom, the distant music fading into a soft echo behind her, replaced by the quiet rhythm of the city, steady and real. She paused for a moment on the sidewalk, her hand resting lightly against her clutch, feeling the outline of the card inside, the small, tangible reminder that what had happened was not imagined, not something she could dismiss once the lights dimmed and the voices disappeared. A car passed by slowly, headlights sweeping across the pavement, and she exhaled, her breath visible for a brief second in the cool air, grounding her in the present, in the life she was returning to, a life that still held responsibilities, routines, and a little boy who would wake up in the morning expecting her to be exactly who she had always been, but something inside her had shifted, not loudly, Not in a way anyone else could see, but enough that she could feel it. In the way she stood, in the way she breathed, in the quiet certainty that had replaced the doubt she carried into that room hours ago, she reached into her clutch and pulled out the card, holding it under the streetlight, the clean lettering catching the glow as if it belonged to a different world, one that now felt closer than it had any right to be. She traced the edge of it with her thumb, remembering his voice, calm and steady, not asking her to change, not promising anything beyond the truth, just offering a door and leaving it to her to decide if she would walk through it. Her other hand moved instinctively to her wrist, slipping beneath the sleeve of her dress until her fingers found the bracelet, the small charm, resting against her skin like it always had. And for the first time, she did not see it as a quiet keepsake from a past she had never questioned. She saw it as a beginning, something placed in her life long before she understood its meaning, waiting patiently for the moment she would be ready to follow it. She let out a slow breath, her gaze lifting from the card to the city stretching out in front of her, lights glowing in windows, cars moving in quiet patterns, lives continuing in ways that did not pause for moments like hers, and yet she knew that for her, everything had changed. Not because of who he was, not because of where he had come from, but because of what she had chosen when she could have walked away. She slipped the card back into her clutch, her movement steady, deliberate, not hesitant anymore, and as she turned to leave, she felt a quiet sense of direction settle into her, not a map, not a plan, but a knowing that she would follow through, that she would show up. Not for him, not for answers alone, but for herself. The sound of her steps against the pavement was soft but certain as she moved forward, her shoulders no longer weighed down by the invisible pressure she had carried for so long, her posture no longer shaped by the need to disappear into the background. Somewhere behind her, the music continued, laughter rising into the night, but she did not look back again, because she understood now that the most important part of the evening had never been inside that room. It had been the moment she chose to stop accepting the version of her life that others had quietly assigned to her. She walked on, the city opening in front of her, the future no longer something distant or fixed, but something she could step into, something she could shape. And as she reached the corner and paused at the light, her reflection caught briefly in the glass of a nearby window. She saw it clearly for the first time, not the woman who had sat alone at a table surrounded by whispers, but someone else entirely, someone who had been there all along, waiting for the moment she would finally choose to be seen. And as the light changed and she stepped forward, one thought settled quietly, firmly, like an echo she would carry with her long after this night faded. He had offered her a place beside him, but what mattered most was that she had chosen not to stand alone anymore.